Rancher gives water to wounded native. Right next, entire tribes arrive on horseback. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a hot, dry afternoon in the rugged desert of the American West, a lone rancher named Thomas Williams stood on his porch, staring out at the endless expanse of parched earth. His ranch, a small piece of land he had fought for years to keep, sat quietly in the barren landscape, far from the bustling towns and settlements. He was a man used to solitude, and he preferred it that way. The only sounds that broke the stillness were the occasional bleat of his sheep and the distant calls of coyotes. As the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Thomas heard a faint sound in the distance, a soft whinnying. It was not the usual sound of his own horses. He squinted into the horizon, his curiosity piqued. As he walked towards the edge of his land, the sound grew louder. A figure appeared in the distance, a rider on horseback, but there was something different about this rider. His horse was struggling, limping along the dusty trail. Thomas felt a twinge of concern. He knew the terrain could be treacherous, especially for an injured horse. As the rider drew closer, Thomas could see the bloodstains on the horse's flank. His heart sank. The rider was a Native American man, his face smeared with dirt and exhaustion, but the most striking thing was his appearance. The man was badly wounded, his clothes torn and bloodied, and he was struggling to stay on the horse. Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but his compassion won over his caution. He rushed forward, waving his arms to catch the rider's attention. The man, barely able to sit upright, seemed to notice him just in time. He whispered something, his voice barely audible, before slumping forward, unable to keep himself upright any longer. His horse finally came to a halt at Thomas's feet, and the rider collapsed onto the ground. Thomas knelt beside him, his heart racing. The man was still alive, but just barely. Blood soaked through his shirt, and his face was pale with pain. Without hesitation, Thomas helped the man to his feet and led him to his cabin. He knew he couldn't leave the man there to die. Inside, he carefully laid him on the old wooden floor, grabbing what little medical supplies he had. He did what he could to stop the bleeding, offering the man water as best as he could. He wasn't sure if the man would survive the night, but he couldn't just leave him. He had done this before, helped people in need, but this felt different. There was something about the way the man looked at him, as if he knew Thomas would help him, even in such a dire situation. As the night wore on, Thomas kept watch over the injured man, checking his pulse and temperature, doing what he could to keep him stable. Just as the first light of dawn began to break, something caught his attention. The sound of horses. Not just one or two, but a whole herd. The sound grew louder, and soon, a line of riders appeared on the horizon. At first, Thomas thought they might be just travelers or ranchers, but as they drew closer, his heart raced. They were Native American warriors, their horses moving in perfect unison, and their leader, a tall man with a commanding presence, rode at the front. There were hundreds of them, all with war paint and weapons at the ready. Thomas's mind raced. He had no idea why they were here, but he feared the worst. As they arrived at his cabin, the leader dismounted, walking towards Thomas. There was a moment of silence, and then the leader spoke, his voice deep and filled with authority. "You saved him," he said. "Now we are here to thank you." The tribe had come, not for vengeance or war, but to honor the rancher who had helped one of their own. They had watched from afar as Thomas helped the wounded man, and they were here to repay his kindness. Thomas stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never expected this. What had started as a simple act of compassion had turned into something much greater. The warriors knelt before him, their faces filled with respect and gratitude. It was a moment of pure magic, as if the universe had rewarded him for his good deed. Thomas realized, in that instant, that kindness could create miracles. The tribe offered him gifts, promised protection, and even spoke of a lasting bond between them. Thomas's world had changed in ways he could never have imagined, and he knew that this act of kindness would echo through his life forever. The morning after the warriors arrived, Thomas stood outside his cabin, still trying to grasp the full magnitude of what had happened. The previous night, after the Native American warriors had surrounded his ranch, he had barely been able to process the words of their leader. They had thanked him, honored him for his kindness, and promised to protect him from any threat. The warriors had left early, taking their wounded comrade with them, but they had left behind a heavy silence in the air. It felt surreal, like something from one of the stories his grandfather used to tell. He had always believed that kindness had its place, but he never imagined it could lead to something like this. As the sun began to rise higher, casting golden rays across the barren landscape, Thomas thought about what the tribe had said. They spoke of a bond, a shared understanding between him and the Apache. They had noticed his actions, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return, and now they felt an unspoken connection. He knew the world around him was harsh, and the idea of peace between two such different people seemed impossible, yet here he was, standing in the middle of it. He had not asked for this, nor had he expected such grand gestures, but he felt a strange sense of fulfillment in knowing that he had made a difference in someone's life. That day, Thomas spent hours working on his ranch, trying to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the warriors, to the respect they had shown him. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a horse's hooves approaching in the distance. He stopped what he was doing and glanced over his shoulder. The rider was familiar, the same Apache leader who had spoken to him the day before. As the rider drew nearer, Thomas felt a mix of curiosity and caution. He had never interacted with Native Americans on this level before, and while he had offered his help out of sheer compassion, he had no idea what more they might want. The leader dismounted and walked toward Thomas, his face calm, but carrying an air of authority. "We did not come to just thank you," the leader said, his voice steady. "You saved one of our own, and now we seek your help." Thomas listened intently, unsure of what was being asked of him. The leader continued, "There is a threat to our people. A group of settlers has been encroaching on our land. They seek to drive us from our homes, and we need someone who understands the land, someone who can help us navigate this dangerous terrain." Thomas's heart raced. He had no idea that helping this one man would lead to such a request. He had been living his life in isolation for years, avoiding the complexities of society, but now he was being asked to take a stand. The leader saw the hesitation in Thomas's eyes and quickly added, "We do not seek to bring war. We simply wish to protect our way of life. You have shown us your strength through kindness, and we believe you are capable of helping us." Thomas took a deep breath. He had always been a man of principle, someone who valued doing what was right, but this was something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Helping a wounded man was one thing, but standing against a group of settlers who were likely armed and dangerous was another. He had no experience with warfare, no desire to fight, but something in his gut told him that this was not about violence. This was about survival. The leader watched him closely, waiting for his response. After a long pause, Thomas spoke, his voice firm but thoughtful. "I will help you, not with weapons or bloodshed, but with what I know. I'll show you the land, help you find a way to protect your people without conflict if I can." The leader nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Your help will not be forgotten," he said. And just like that, Thomas found himself entangled in something much larger than his quiet life on the ranch. He had offered his help out of kindness. And now, in return, he was about to become part of something that would change the course of his life forever. As the leader turned to leave, he paused and glanced back at Thomas. "We ride at dawn tomorrow. Be ready." Thomas watched him ride off, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had agreed to help, but the gravity of the situation was just beginning to sink in. This was not just about a man helping a stranger. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. As the day drew to a close, Thomas stood alone once more, staring out across the open land. The horizon seemed both endless and full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a man who had made a choice that would not only define his future, but also impact the lives of those around him. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the dusty earth, Thomas stood by his cabin, preparing himself for the journey ahead. The Native American leader had made it clear that they would ride at dawn, and now, with the cold morning air biting at his skin, Thomas felt the weight of the decision he had made. It wasn't just about guiding them through the land. It was about the responsibility he had taken on. He had chosen to help them, and there was no turning back. As he saddled his horse, his thoughts drifted back to the night before, to the conversation with the leader. "We will ride tomorrow," the leader had said. "You will guide us to the places where the settlers will not expect us. We seek peace, not violence, but if they push us to the edge, we will defend ourselves." The words echoed in his mind. They had promised not to seek war, but there was always the possibility that the settlers would force them into a fight. Thomas had heard rumors about the encroachment of settlers on Native American land, but he had never imagined he would be involved in such a conflict. Still, he had agreed. He had offered his help, and now, as he rode out into the wilderness, he could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. His ranch was miles from the nearest town, isolated from the rest of the world. And yet, this was a moment that would tie him to something far larger than his quiet life. As he reached the edge of his property, he saw the Apache warriors waiting for him, mounted on their horses, their faces painted with determination. The leader, the man who had spoken to him the day before, was already on his horse, ready to go. His eyes met Thomas's, and for a brief moment, there was a wordless understanding between them. Thomas could feel the gravity of the situation, the silent acknowledgement that this was not just a journey. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. "Are you ready?" the leader asked, his voice calm but firm. Thomas nodded, tightening his grip on the reins. "I'm ready." With that, they set off, the sound of hooves echoing in the stillness of the morning. The journey took them through rugged terrain, across rivers, and over rocky hills. Thomas guided them through the land he knew so well, pointing out landmarks and hiding spots. He was careful, always looking ahead, always aware of the danger that could be lurking just around the corner. The Apache warriors moved with precision, their horses galloping in unison, their eyes scanning the horizon. They didn't speak much, but Thomas could sense the quiet determination in their movements. They were not warriors looking for a fight. They were people who had been pushed to the edge, people who had been forced to defend their land. After several hours of travel, they reached the outskirts of a dense forest, where Thomas stopped and turned to the leader. "We can rest here for a while," he said, his voice low. The leader nodded, signaling to the others. They dismounted and began to set up camp, their movements efficient, practiced. As the fire crackled, Thomas sat apart from the group, staring into the flames. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. Would the settlers accept the peace that the Apache sought, or would they bring war to the doorstep of his quiet life? He had no answers, only the uncertainty of the road ahead. As night fell and the warriors settled into a watchful silence, Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice. It was the leader, who had come to sit beside him, by the fire. "You are a man of honor," the leader said, his tone quiet but sincere. "We do not forget the kindness you have shown us." Thomas glanced at the man, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "I don't know if I'm a man of honor," Thomas replied, his voice low. "I just do what I think is right." The leader nodded, as if understanding something deeper. "Sometimes, doing what is right is all we can do. But it takes courage to stand with those who are different from us, to stand against the world when it tells us to turn away." Thomas was silent for a moment, the weight of the leader's words settling in his mind. It had been a long time since he had felt part of something larger than himself, and now, as he sat beside this group of warriors, he realized that the path he had chosen was one of great importance. They were not just fighting for land. They were fighting for their way of life, for something that had been threatened by those who sought to take it from them. And in some strange way, Thomas had become a part of that fight. As the night wore on, Thomas laid down beneath the stars, the sounds of the desert quieting around him. He closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense that his actions could make a difference. The journey was far from over, and he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the courage to do what was right. The next day, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the rocky terrain, Thomas and the Apache warriors continued their journey. The silence between them had grown more comfortable now, their shared understanding of their mission creating a bond that had not been there when they first met. The land was vast and unforgiving, but Thomas had become accustomed to its rhythms. He knew the secret paths, the hidden water sources, and the areas where danger might be lurking. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Thomas felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. He was no longer just a rancher. He had become part of something much larger. The Apache had trusted him, and now, as they neared the edge of the settlers' land, he couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right choice. The leader, who had remained silent for much of the journey, finally spoke. His voice was low but carried authority. "We approach the land where the settlers are. We will need your knowledge of this area. If they threaten us, we will not hesitate to defend ourselves. But if we can avoid bloodshed, we will." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had never wanted to be part of a war, but he understood the Apaches' need to protect their way of life. They had already lost so much, and now their land was being encroached upon by those who cared little for the consequences. The group continued to ride, the sound of hooves echoing through the empty wilderness. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The dry, rocky terrain slowly gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, Thomas could see the outline of the settlers' cabins. He had grown up hearing stories about the tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans, but he had never imagined he would be caught in the middle of it. The closer they got, the more Thomas could sense the tension building. The Apache warriors were on high alert, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. They had already made it clear that they would not hesitate to fight if necessary, but Thomas could see the fear in their eyes. They were not warriors by choice, but by necessity. As they neared the first cabin, Thomas noticed a small group of settlers gathered outside, talking amongst themselves. The leader of the Apache group raised his hand, signaling for everyone to halt. He motioned for Thomas to ride ahead. "You know their ways," the leader said quietly. "Go and speak with them. If they wish to negotiate, we will listen. But if they draw their weapons, we will not back down." Thomas hesitated for a moment. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he knew that he had to try. He had to be the bridge between the two sides, to find a way to avoid the bloodshed that seemed inevitable. Taking a deep breath, he rode toward the settlers. As he approached, the settlers fell silent, watching him with suspicion. Thomas dismounted, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. "I come in peace," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The Apache are not here to fight, but to protect what is theirs. They seek no harm. If you wish to talk, we can talk." One of the settlers, a tall man with a weathered face, stepped forward. His eyes were narrow, filled with distrust. "You expect us to believe that?" he spat. "These savages are taking our land. They've been raiding our farms for months, and now you want us to sit down and talk." Thomas's heart sank. He had known that the settlers would not easily accept the Apache's claims, but he had hoped that reason could prevail. "These people have lost everything," Thomas said, his voice rising. "Their homes, their families, their way of life. They are not the ones who started this fight. They just want to be left in peace." The settler laughed bitterly. "Peace? You think they'll just leave us alone? We've been here for years, building our homes, our lives. And now they want to take it all away." The tension between them was palpable. Thomas could feel the anger in the air, the deep divide between the two sides. He knew that words alone might not be enough. As the conversation continued, the sound of horses approaching from behind interrupted them. The Apache warriors had moved forward, their presence undeniable. The settler's face hardened, and he reached for his weapon. Thomas's heart raced. This was the moment of truth. "Hold on," Thomas shouted, his voice pleading. "We don't need to do this. There's a way for both sides to live in peace. We don't have to fight." The settler paused, his hand hovering over his gun. He looked back at his companions, then at the Apache warriors, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The leader of the Apache stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We seek only peace," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "But we will not stand idly by while our land is taken from us." The tension in the air was thick, but it was clear that neither side wanted to fight. And yet, the fear of the unknown, of what might happen if negotiations failed, lingered in the air. Thomas took a deep breath, praying for a peaceful resolution. "Let's sit down and talk," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "There's always a way forward, even when it seems impossible." The tension in the air was palpable as both sides stood their ground. Thomas could feel the weight of the moment, The turning point that could either lead to peace or escalate into something much worse. He could see the uncertainty in the settlers' eyes and the quiet determination in the Apache warriors. The leader of the Apache tribe stood firm, his expression one of calm but undeniable strength. His people were ready, but they were waiting, just as Thomas was, for a sign that the settlers were willing to talk. The tall settler, the one who had spoken earlier with such hostility, seemed to be struggling with his thoughts. His hand hovered over his gun for a moment longer, but then he lowered it slowly, as if unsure of what his next move should be. The quiet that followed felt almost unnatural, and it stretched on longer than Thomas was comfortable with. Finally, the settler spoke. "We have been pushed too far," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with frustration. "Our families have worked these lands for years. We have no choice but to defend ourselves." Thomas could feel the weight of those words, but he didn't back down. "I understand your anger," he said, his voice steady. "But violence isn't the answer. There's a way for both sides to live here, peacefully. It doesn't have to be this way." The settler paused, looking at Thomas with suspicion, but something in his expression softened. Thomas could see the inner conflict. He wasn't the enemy, and neither were the Apache warriors. The settlers had been misled, fearful of what they didn't understand. "What do you propose?" the settler asked finally, his voice quieter now. The Apache leader stepped forward, his posture respectful but commanding. "We are not here to take your land. We only ask that you respect ours, as we respect yours. There is enough land for all of us. If we work together," he said. "We want to live in peace." Thomas could feel the shift in the air as the words settled over the group. The settlers looked at each other, their expressions guarded but intrigued. The leader of the Apache tribe was speaking the truth, and for the first time, the settlers began to see the possibility of something beyond the fear and the anger that had driven them for so long. The tall settler nodded slowly. "And if we agree to this peace?" he asked. "What happens then?" The Apache leader's eyes met Thomas's before he spoke. "Then we will leave you in peace. There will be no more fighting, no more fear. We will work with you, help each other, and create something better." Thomas held his breath, watching as the settlers exchanged glances, weighing the words that had been spoken. For a long moment, there was nothing but the rustling of the wind and the distant sound of birds. Then the tall settler took a step forward, his shoulders relaxing. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll give it a try, but we will need time. You can't just expect us to trust you after everything." The Apache leader nodded, understanding the hesitation. "We are not asking for trust. We are asking for a chance to prove ourselves," he said. With that, the tension that had been hanging in the air slowly began to dissipate. The Apache warriors remained vigilant, but they lowered their weapons, signaling that they were not there to fight. The settlers, though still wary, lowered their own hands from their weapons. Thomas could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. This was not the end of their struggles, but it was a beginning. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude. The tall settler looked at him and nodded, his eyes showing a glimmer of something that had been missing before: respect. "You've done something none of us could," he said. "Maybe there's more to this land than just owning it." The Apache leader stepped back, signaling for his warriors to gather. "We will return to our camp," he said, "but we will keep our word. Peace will be our path forward." As the Apache warriors mounted their horses and began to ride away, Thomas stood there, watching them go. The settlers remained behind, still processing what had just happened. It was clear that this wasn't a simple resolution, but a new chapter had begun. Thomas felt the weight of the promise he had made, but he also felt the stirrings of something deeper, an understanding that peace could come, even in the most unlikely of places. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the possibility of something different, something better. The desert stretched out before him, its harsh beauty unchanged, but now, for the first time, he saw it not as a land of division, but as a land of potential. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but Thomas knew one thing for sure. They had a chance, and that was enough for now. The days that followed the uneasy truce between the settlers and the Apache warriors were quiet, almost too quiet. The sun beat down relentlessly on the land, and yet, the heavy silence that hung in the air seemed to weigh more than the desert heat. Thomas spent most of his time working on the ranch, trying to keep his mind occupied, but it was difficult. Every time he looked out across the fields, he saw the line of settlers' cabins in the distance, and a part of him wondered whether they would keep their word. Could peace really exist between these two sides? Could trust be built from the ashes of so much conflict? The Apache leader had promised peace, and the settlers had agreed to try, but Thomas knew that promises were fragile things. In the early morning light, Thomas stood at the edge of his land, looking out at the horizon. He saw movement, 2 riders coming toward him. He recognized one of them immediately, the tall settler who had spoken to him before. The other was a younger man, a settler Thomas hadn't met yet. As they drew closer, Thomas could see the tension in their posture, the wariness still there beneath the surface. They were here to talk, but how far had their trust really gone? The tall settler waved as he approached. "Morning," he called out, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "We need to talk." Thomas nodded and walked toward them, his heart beating a little faster. "What's on your mind?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The tall settler glanced at the younger man before speaking again. "We've been discussing things among ourselves," he began, "and we think it's time to find out where we all stand." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The younger settler spoke up, his voice more tense than the first. "The Apache have made their move. We can't just ignore them anymore. If we're going to work together, we need to know where everyone stands. Are they really going to stick to this peace, or are they just waiting for the right moment to strike?" Thomas looked between the two of them, sensing the unease in the air. The tension was still there, and it was clear that the settlers weren't ready to fully trust the Apache. He knew that peace wouldn't come easily, but he believed it was possible. "You've got to give them a chance," Thomas said firmly. "They've agreed to this truce. We all agreed. You can't just back out now because you're scared. Fear has been controlling this land for too long." The tall settler looked at him, then at the younger man. There was a long silence before the younger settler finally spoke. "I don't trust them, and I don't trust you either, for that matter." Thomas sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on him. "I don't expect you to trust them right away, but you've got to trust the process. We can't go on living in fear. If we want this to work, we have to take the first step. All of us." The younger settler shook his head, clearly frustrated. "It's not that simple. We've lost too much. My brother died in a raid last year, and I've lost friends to their raids. How do you expect me to forget that?" Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "I know. I understand your anger. I've seen what this land does to people. But if we keep going down this path, we're just going to keep losing more. It's time to make a change." The tall settler stepped forward, his face hard but thoughtful. "You're asking a lot, Thomas. But maybe you're right. We've been at war for too long. Maybe it's time we try something different." Thomas nodded, relieved to see the first signs of understanding. "All I'm asking is for a chance. Let's build something better, together." The younger settler looked at him for a long moment, then, finally, nodded reluctantly. "All right, I'll give it a shot. But if anything goes wrong, we'll hold you responsible." Thomas nodded, knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a start. As the two settlers turned to leave, Thomas watched them go, feeling a cautious optimism begin to stir within him. Peace wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe it might just work. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Thomas found himself back at the edge of the land, watching the horizon once more. The Apache warriors had kept their word, remaining peaceful, but there was still a deep sense of uncertainty in the air. He had made a choice to stand by the Apache, to help bridge the gap between them and the settlers, but it was a delicate balance. He had to believe that peace could be achieved. If not, they would all lose. As the light faded and the stars began to twinkle in the clear night sky, Thomas made a vow to himself. He would fight for peace. No matter what it took, he would stand by his word. This land, this fragile peace, was worth fighting for. The following weeks were tense but hopeful. The uneasy truce between the settlers and the Apache was still fragile, held together by the promises made under the harsh desert sky. Thomas continued to work on his ranch, but now there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Each day felt like it could tip one way or the other, toward peace or toward conflict. The Apache had kept their word, staying on their land and moving only when necessary. The settlers had begun to slowly accept the situation, but the fear that had once been so prevalent still lingered in their hearts. One morning, As Thomas was finishing his chores, he saw the familiar silhouette of the Apache leader riding toward his ranch. The warrior was alone, his horse moving at a steady pace. Thomas walked out to meet him, his boots crunching in the dirt. The leader slowed as he approached, his gaze meeting Thomas's with the quiet intensity Thomas had come to respect. "We need to talk," the Apache leader said, his voice low but firm. Thomas nodded and led him to the shade of an old oak tree near the barn. "What's on your mind?" Thomas asked, already feeling the weight of the moment. The Apache leader dismounted, his face showing no signs of urgency, but his eyes betrayed a sense of concern. "The settlers," he began. "They've been talking amongst themselves. They are worried about their land, their families. They still do not fully trust us." Thomas sighed, feeling the familiar knot of frustration form in his stomach. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but we've made progress. They've agreed to live in peace, haven't they?" "They have," the Apache leader confirmed. "But the fear remains. There are some who still believe we are the enemy. They are afraid we will take everything they have." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, looking out over the ranch. The sun was still low, and the land seemed calm, but he knew the tension was still simmering just beneath the surface. "I told them that peace was the way forward," Thomas said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I thought they understood. I thought this could work." The Apache leader regarded him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "It is not just about trust," he said. "It is about survival. The settlers have been taught to fear us, and they have been taught to protect what they believe is theirs. We can't change that overnight." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the depth of the problem. He had hoped that the settlers would come to see the Apache as neighbors, as people who were simply trying to survive in the same land, but fear was a powerful thing. "So what do we do now?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but uncertain. "We must show them that we are not the enemy," the Apache leader said. "We must prove that we are willing to live in peace, to help them, not harm them. We must show them that our way of life can coexist with theirs." Thomas thought for a moment, considering the leader's words. "And how do you propose we do that?" he asked. "We offer our help," the Apache leader replied. "We help them with their crops, their cattle, anything they need. We show them that we are willing to work side by side, that we are not just here to take. We are here to build something together." The idea seemed both simple and impossible at the same time. Thomas had spent his entire life working the land on his own, not relying on anyone else. But now, the situation was different. "I'll talk to them," Thomas said finally. "I'll offer them our help. It's the only way we'll move forward." The Apache leader nodded, his expression softening. "I knew you would understand." Thomas watched as the warrior mounted his horse once more, preparing to leave. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. The Apache leader paused, looking back at him. "You are a good man, Thomas," he said. "The world needs more men like you." As the leader rode off, Thomas stood there for a long time, watching the warrior disappear into the distance. The task ahead was daunting, but he felt a renewed sense of determination. It was clear now that peace would not come easily. It would take more than just words. It would take action, trust, and time. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt hopeful. There was still a long road ahead, but he was ready to walk it. The sun had risen higher in the sky, and the land before him stretched out endlessly. It was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful in its own way. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way for both the settlers and the Apache to find peace here, on this land that they all called home. The days following Thomas's conversation with the Apache leader passed in a strange kind of quiet anticipation. Thomas kept his promise to the Apache, going to the settlers' land and offering them the help they had been so reluctant to accept. The sun was beginning to set when he rode out to the settlers' cabins once again, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to propose. As he reached the outskirts of their camp, he saw several of the settlers standing outside, their hands on their hips, waiting for him. The tall settler, the one who had spoken to him before, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You came back," he said, his voice neither friendly nor hostile, just cautious. Thomas nodded, his gaze steady. "I came to offer something we both need, peace." The tall settler glanced over at the other men, who seemed just as wary as ever. "What kind of peace are you talking about?" he asked. Thomas took a deep breath, his voice steady. "The Apache are offering to help. They're willing to work with you. They can help." with the crops, with the cattle, whatever you need. But we need to work together. We need to build trust, and we need to do it now before the situation escalates. There was a long silence as the settlers looked between each other, uncertainty written across their faces. "You're asking us to trust them," one of the younger settlers said, his voice full of doubt. "After everything they've done to us? How do we know this isn't just another trick?" Thomas understood the fear in the man's voice. He had felt it himself, but he had also seen the possibility of something more, something better. "I'm not asking you to trust them overnight," he said, "but you've got to give them a chance. They're not asking for war. They're asking for peace." The tall settler folded his arms, clearly wrestling with the decision. "And if we help them and they turn on us? What happens then?" Thomas met his gaze. "Then we deal with it, together. But I don't think they'll turn on us. I think they want the same thing we do, just to live without fear." The younger settler spoke up again, his tone harsh. "And if it's just another trap? If they're trying to push us out of our land?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't believe that. I've seen them. I've seen the way they've held to their word. They're not looking for a fight, but they will fight if they have to." The tall settler remained quiet for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on him. Thomas could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, the tall settler nodded, though his eyes were still filled with doubt. "All right," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll give it a shot. But if anything goes wrong, we'll defend ourselves. I can't promise you that we'll just sit back and do nothing." Thomas nodded. "I understand. But this is the best chance we have. If we don't try, then we're already lost." With that, the group of settlers reluctantly agreed. The Apache leader was called, and word spread quickly that a meeting would be held. That evening, the two sides came together, facing each other in the dimming light of the desert sunset. The Apache warriors, led by their chief, rode forward, their horses moving in perfect unison. Thomas stood in the middle of the gathering, his heart pounding in his chest as the tension between the two groups grew palpable. The tall settler stepped forward, his voice firm as he addressed the Apache leader. "We've agreed to your offer," he said. "But understand this. We're doing this on the condition that we all respect each other's land. No more trespassing, no more fear." The Apache leader nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "We agree," he said. "We will respect your land as you will respect ours." The two groups stood facing each other, the silence between them heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the Apache warriors dismounted and extended his hand to the settlers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a powerful message. After a moment of hesitation, the tall settler stepped forward and shook the Apache warrior's hand. "This is a start," he said, his voice softer than before. As the handshakes were exchanged, Thomas felt the last of the tension in the air begin to dissipate. This wasn't the end of their struggle, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two sides gathered around a fire, sharing stories and food, building the trust that had been so long in the making. That night, as Thomas lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into an uneasy peace, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. There was a chance now, a chance for peace, a chance for something better. And that was enough for him to believe in. As the weeks turned into months, the fragile peace that had been established between the settlers and the Apache began to take root. It was not without its challenges, but each day brought small victories. Thomas watched as the two sides slowly began to trust one another, not just through words, but through actions. The Apache helped the settlers with their crops, offering their knowledge of the land, and the settlers, in turn, shared their tools and resources. It was a slow process, but it was progress. The once hostile divide was now a place of cooperation, a new chapter in the lives of both the settlers and the Apache. Thomas continued to work his ranch, but his role had shifted. He was no longer just a rancher. He had become a symbol of peace between two worlds that had long been at odds. His days were filled with discussions, meetings, and planning with both sides, helping to mediate when tensions flared and offering guidance when needed. As the harvest season arrived, the settlers and the Apache worked side by side, gathering crops and preparing for the winter. It was the first time that Thomas had ever seen such a scene, settlers and Apache warriors working together as equals, not enemies. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Thomas stood at the edge of his land, watching the workers finish for the day. The tall settler, who had once been the most vocal opponent of peace, walked up beside him. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but content. "I never thought I'd see this day," the tall settler said, his voice filled with quiet awe. Thomas smiled, a sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. "Neither did I," he replied. "But here we are." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the workers as they made their way back to the camp. It was a peaceful sight, one that had seemed impossible just months ago. The tall settler cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I was wrong, Thomas. About all of it. I thought they would take our land, our way of life. I thought peace was impossible. But you were right. You were right about everything." Thomas turned to him, his expression somber. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone, on both sides. Peace isn't easy, and it's not perfect, but it's worth fighting for." The settler nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "We have a long way to go," he said, "but at least we've started. And that's something." As the night grew darker, Thomas and the tall settler parted ways, each heading back to their respective homes. But there was no longer any fear between them, no distrust. There was only the quiet understanding that peace was something worth fighting for, even when it seemed out of reach. In the months that followed, the community continued to grow stronger. The settlers and the Apache worked together, helping one another in ways that had once seemed unimaginable. The land, once a place of conflict, had become a place of cooperation. It was a long road, but each step forward was a testament to the power of kindness, of understanding, and of the possibility of change. Thomas stood at the edge of his land one last time, looking out at the horizon. The world had changed in ways he never thought possible, and as the sun set, he knew that there was still work to be done. But for the first time in his life, he felt hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different. And that was enough for him to keep going. The journey was far from over, but it was a journey worth taking.